Okay, I guess it's working now.
And also make sure that you have shared computer sound. You know, if you were in the right spot for that, more shared sound.
Okay. You think we're good?
I can log into your Zoom and check. What's your Zoom? Does it have like a username associated?
Oh, I don't know what the Zoom ID is. I've never hosted a meeting before.
Is it just like your email?
Yeah, it's just my UW email, CANDE@uw.edu. Can you find meetings like that? I don't know how Zoom works at all, actually.
Oh, damn. Okay, it's not. I think we're gonna have to try.
Oh, there we go.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay.
There's the meeting ID.
Sorry, guys.
Well, I have to let you in. This is ridiculous. Oh yeah, there you are. Yeah, you can hear me. It's working. All right.
Sweet. Okay.
Okay. All right, everybody. I'm going to be giving a short presentation on some mixing tips and tricks. Kind of a disclaimer to get started. I am no master at this. Kind of the most growth that I think I've gotten over the course of the pandemic in music making has been like my mixing skill. Like just listening to stuff I did like 6 months ago, I'm like, man, who was that guy? What was he doing? So hopefully this is a collection of things that I've learned and stuff from what my own practice, and also a collection of stuff I found online from people who probably know a little bit more than I do. So hopefully there's some things here that can be helpful to people. So I just want to get started by telling you all right now that you need to download this plugin right now. This is a free visualizer called Span by Voxengo. And it's probably like one of the best like visualizer plugins that you can have. It just like really clearly shows what's going on in your mix as far as frequencies go. And you can really dial in how the visualizer works through the settings, which is just really helpful. It allows you to see things in different ways. So I really recommend downloading this, maybe looking up some tutorials on how people like to use it. But that's the first thing I want to say, is that this is like the beginning of the change in your mixing. And kind of connected to that is knowing what you want for your mix and having a reference track. I think having Voxengo Span and having a reference track really immediately can help increase the quality of your mixes. So with a reference track, you pick something that's maybe in the style of something you're producing, or at least kind of has the feel you want to go for. And then you can kind of A/B it against the stuff you're working on. You can use Span to look at the kind of frequency spectrum of your mix versus the reference track you're working with. Something I like to do a lot is I will like cut down to just the low ends, or just the highs, or just the mids of both of our tracks, and kind of compare what's going on in them. Do you think you can catch the door for me? Yeah. And it's just something that can be really useful to kind of get your head into like outside of the compositional space, where you're really writing what you want to do, and really get into a space of that's more like critical, and where you're really comparing things, and it gives you a reference to judge your mix by. So with those two things out of the way, I'm going to mention some kind of ways that people can structure their mixing process. So one of the big things that you'll see if you look up mixing tips and tricks is people talking about bouncing all their audio out and mixing, or just mixing with their live plugin. And so it's more or less what it sounds like. There are lots of people who really love the workflow of bouncing out all of their audio to separate tracks and using a whole new project file and mixing everything after that. And of course, the alternative is just mixing within the project file you've been working on the track in the whole time. I've tried both many times, and I've really never found that I have a ton of success with the bouncing option, but it's, I think, very much just up to personal taste. I really love being able to tweak all the things that I've made during the whole time while I mix. So I prefer not to have everything bounced out to audio. And in some aspects, that's something I need to get better at because I really drain my CPU sometimes. But yeah, especially if you have a computer that isn't necessarily very powerful, if you're having a lot of stuttering issues, just playing back your mix, bouncing can be a lifesaver in being able to really hear what's going on. The next thing I want to talk about is mixing in order. This is another kind of thing that you'll see if you look up how to help with mixing, is that people talk about mixing elements in a certain order to help keep your track balanced. And so as far as tracks go, it's kind of two routes here, is tracks and effects. And so as far as mixing your tracks goes, most people will tell you start with the kick and the bass. And what that means is you take all your mixers, all your fader knobs, you slide them all down to 0, except for the kick and the bass. And you want to get those to sound nice together. And then you can start adding in other elements, like maybe you add the snare next. Or if you're working on a vocal track, you really want to make sure the vocal is popping. So you want it to sit well against your kick and your bass. And so the mixing in order is something that a lot of people recommend. And it can really help give you fresh ears on your track. If you turn everything off except for 2 elements, and now all of a sudden you're almost starting from scratch. And it's kind of like you've entered a new stage of the production process. And so the other element of this mixing in order kind of has to do with the production phase, but especially if you're working with more, I guess, traditional digital music where you're working with, recorded instruments, recorded vocals, people talk a lot about how you do your effects and how you order your effects chains. And so what this generally ends up looking like is you want your EQs, you want to EQ out some harsh frequencies, and then after that, you'll do your compression. You don't want to do the compression before the EQing. You don't necessarily want to do your strong EQing after the compression. And then, you can add your kind of sonic effects like reverb, delays, sometimes distortion, and sometimes distortion, depending on the genre, you want to do before compression. But generally, the main thing is you want to EQ, compress, and then add kind of your crazier effects that kind of help put the sound in a space rather than give it its character. And then the last thing I want to mention is mixing with mastering compression on. This is kind of like a hot topic as far as mixing goes. If you talk to any of the big engineers, they will tell you, do not mix with master bus compression on. And I think that this has been kind of a concept that's changing lately. And I think especially within kind of the area that I work in with more EDM music, there's a lot of people who will mix with some compression on. I personally, I put a limiter on my master bus the entire time I'm working on a track. So all of my elements are down at my mix volume, but the whole time I'm hearing it at a quote unquote mastered volume at 0 dB, just because it helps me. I feel like I get a better feel for the final result. But a lot of people will tell you that you're gonna not hear the mix properly, and especially if you over compress, if you're not careful with your master compression, you can really squash out the dynamics before you have a chance to create them. So as far as that goes, if you're turning out really flat mixes while using master compression during mixing, try mixing without it. And maybe the other way around, if you're turning out mixes that you really don't like the sound of, maybe try doing it with a little bit of limiting compression to bring it up to 0 dB and see how you feel. And so this has all been kind of wishy-washy, but these are kind of different methods that people use to structure their kind of mixing. So now I'm going to move into a little bit more specific things and talk about EQing and filtering. And so with EQing and filtering, there's kind of three really important things that people like to talk about. I'm actually going to start down here. A lot of people, or a lot of YouTube videos, when you look this kind of stuff up, they will tell you to roll off the lows of everything in your mix that isn't meant to have any bass elements. And I will say that that can be very, very effective at giving you headroom. And headroom is a term that just means how much space you have between your mix and 0 dB. And basically what headroom does is it gives your mastering engineer, or you, if you're going to master your own track, it gives you the space to be able to push your track's volume to get it to a proper mastered volume without having some weird artifacting. And you know, if you have like a lead element that's creating that for some reason, maybe it's because of distortion or some effects you're putting on, if it has some low frequency content that you aren't necessarily hearing, it adds to the total volume of your track. And when you go to compress everything, it can limit the amount that you can actually push that. So for a lot of elements, people tell you to roll off the lows, but that isn't always something you want to do. It's kind of a tricky thing. You just want to be careful that you're mainly doing it if there's something to be gotten rid of. There's a lot of people who, when they hear this advice, they'll start rolling off some things that are actually a part of the characteristic of a sound that you're working with. And you end up kind of limiting the kind of body and effect that particular sound can have in your mix. So it's something you want to be careful with. And mainly it's when there's things that you know you don't want to hear, and that is going to add some trouble with when it comes to mastering. But the other thing is that people don't mention as much rolling off the highs. And it's really the same thing happens here. Is most elements of your track are going to have some ultra high frequency elements, you know, stuff above 15,000 hertz. And for most elements of your mix, you don't necessarily want to hear that part of the track. You know, there's certain things like your cymbals, crash cymbals, and maybe if you're working in like a heavier bass genre, you really want the kind of crunchy highs, or you want the high end of the vocal, and like your snare drum. But your kick drum, it doesn't need to have that kind of ultra high, or like a tom doesn't need to have the ultra highs, or potentially your lead, if it's much more mid-focused, doesn't need to have those ultra highs. So rounding off the curve at around 15,000 can actually save you a lot of headroom without necessarily limiting the kind of sparkly highs that you want in a final mix. So kind of the main thing that people will tell you to do with EQing as far as mixing goes is you're going to try and cut harmful, people might call, or resonant frequencies. And so that's, if you're looking at your EQ and it's showing you the spectrum, if you're seeing any peaks that are kind of too high, or maybe you take a really fine band filter and sweep over the sound and you find some things that are like, ooh, that doesn't sound right, I don't like that in there. You're going to try and take that element and you're going to cut it out with a really tight kind of peak filter, or potentially a notch filter if you're really trying to get rid of something. And that's really, like, aside from rolling off lows and highs, that's the main thing you're trying to do with EQing in while mixing, because these are the elements that once it comes to mastering, they're going to get pushed up and made more powerful and more noticeable. And it's going to add a lot of harshness to your mix and really be competing with the sound that you want. And related to that is this idea of cutting narrow and boosting wide. And this is really, really related to the harmful and resonant frequencies, is you don't want to do narrow boosts or really wide cuts. Because obviously a wide cut, if I have like a pretty flat filter response, but I have a very wide cut here, this is taking out a very large chunk of sound rather than just cutting out like a very specific frequency. And it's going to really, really change the timbre of your instrument, which in the mixing stage, we really don't necessarily want to do. So as far as cuts goes, you want to have really narrow cuts to cut out just the resonant frequencies. And wide boosts, those have to do more with accentuating a timbre, which is really a broader area than a certain resonant frequency. Because if you're doing a narrow boost, you're just creating a new resonant frequency that you might have to remove later once it comes to mastering. So those are some EQ tricks. Now we're going to move on to panning in stereo. So the first thing to say about panning in stereo is that, especially for any music that you're going to play in like a mainstream concert setting, your sub frequencies, so anything below around about 100 to 130 hertz, should be in mono. There should be almost no stereo information below around 100 to 130 hertz. The reason for this is because it's twofold, is that generally there's only one sub producing element in a speaker setup, or maybe there's two, but it's generally not a two channel, because when you have stereo elements, the thing that makes an element stereo rather than mono is two signals at the same time that are different from each other. If you have a stereo, if you have a channel in the left, which is identical to the channel in the right, that is mono, right? And so when you have a difference in those, what's going to happen is you won't hear it in your headphones, but as soon as that's played live, you're going to get frequency cancellation. And this is actually something I kind of talk about later, but this diagram shows there's a phase difference there. So say I have a sub note that's just a simple sine wave. If I have it stereo pan, which means that they're offset from each other, so it'll sound cool in your headphones to hear this weird, very cool stereo effect in your headphones, one in each ear. But in real life, if you had two subs that were playing that note, or if you had one sub trying to generate the composite of these two notes, which is often the case, what's going to happen is because they're out of sync with each other, they're going to start canceling certain elements, because this whole thing is going to sound quieter than a single wave. And it just has to do with a little bit of math. You know, everything that's below 0 here is going to subtract from everything that's above 0 here. And so it's just gonna end up being a lower amplitude wave after they come together. And if you have them completely offset, say if this peak was moved over here, then you'd have this drop and that peak completely canceling out, and you would hear nothing. And so this is much less of an issue in higher frequencies, just because of our ears and how we feel music. But in the sub frequencies especially, you have to be really careful about what's called phase cancellation or frequency cancellation. And that's like the main reason your sub should always be in mono, is because if it's going to be played live, if it's not in mono, people are not going to hear or feel the bass at all, or it's going to be severely weakened. So that's a really important thing to consider while doing, when thinking about panning in stereo. So all of your bass elements, which you really want to come through, that's your kick, a sub bass, if you're working in like like dubstep or heavy bass, any of your mid basses that have sub information, you want to make sure that everything below about 100 hertz is summed to mono. And so to go along with that is to make up for that mononess, the like lack of excitement, you want everything in your mids and highs to be much wider. And it kind of ends up being this kind of spout shape if you think about the frequency spectrum vertically. It's everything's mono down here and it just gets wider. And you want kind of your widest stereo elements to be at the top, because that just adds the most excitement. And so aside from that, the rest of stereo and panning is really up to taste and just trying to create interest. So one thing you can do is panning elements of your mix in order to add some kind of interest. And sometimes this can sound weird in headphones because they're right up against our ear, but it's one of the great things about music is that it's played in stereo, where a speaker's over here and one's over there, and it creates a much more 3D soundscape. But so panning certain elements, like maybe your hi-hat is panned slightly to the left, or a tom to the right, or maybe you have two kinds of lead elements and you want one to sound like it's coming slightly over there, one over there. These can be really cool things that add a lot to your mix. I know a lot of rock songs will have two guitars, one pan left and right, in order to create a big stereo sound. And sometimes they'll only have one playing, like maybe in an intro. And so it's like only over here, then the other one comes in, and it's a very cool, interesting effect. And another thing is using stereo for dramatic effect. And this is changing how wide your mix is over time. The example I gave here is, say you're working on a vocal track. Something that you can do to add some dramatic power to your mix is during the verses, have your vocal harmonies. Your main vocal should generally be in mono, so that way people can really hear it at all times and it's not going to have any weird cancellation issues. But your vocal harmonies, you usually want them to be kind of panned, but they should be relatively near the center in the verse. And once you get to the chorus, everything can explode out and the harmonies can go fully wide, and that adds like a really cool effect for your listeners.
Quick question.
Yeah, what's up?
What exactly is FL doing when you widen the sound?
Are you talking about FL's like merge, like merge to center widen knob, or
maybe not specifically FL, but just like what does like mono versus like widen?
Yeah. So I think I actually don't know the back end of how most of these plugins work, but my guess for if you're ever seeing like a knob that's like it says stereo on it and you turn it one way and it's mono sounding, you turn it the other way, it sounds very wide. I would guess that what's happening here is what's called the house effect or the Haas effect or something. And what that is it's taking the sound and having it played at different times for left and right. And so if I kind of go back to this image, it's very useful. It's essentially like saying, this is my left channel and that's my right channel. And I'm going to delay them apart from each other. Because phase differences in stereo, phase differences between your left and right channels, it creates a stereo effect. So I would guess that most things that are adding a stereo effect are either doing that, or they're just changing the phase, they're adding a delay effect. Or the other thing they could be doing is adding some kind of filtering. Because the other thing you can do, a stereo is just a difference in left and right. So you can create a stereo effect by adding a filter to one side and not the other. But I would guess it's usually the kind of Haas effect. However, it's Haus. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's Haas. Yeah, it's one of those. But I would guess that that's what they're doing. So that's something to keep in mind. Going back to what I was saying is you maybe don't want to use that effect as much on elements that have a lot of sub in them, because it's going to make the sub much less impactful. Yeah. And if any of you guys have any questions, feel free to bring them up as I'm moving through this. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit about compression. Is there people here who don't know what compression is, or maybe don't have the best understanding of it? Yeah? So compression is essentially a tool that people use in order to really, it's kind of changing the dynamics of what you're working on. So what a compressor usually does is you'll give it audio input and it will have a certain threshold set. You have a threshold dial there. You'll set that to a certain volume or a certain amplitude, and everything above that amplitude is going to trigger the compressor. So you can set that to whatever you want. And then the ratio knob is set to however much the audio that goes above that threshold is going to be attenuated or limited. So if I had a 2-to-1 ratio, what's going to happen is if I have a track that, let's say, the largest it goes is up to, I don't know, let's for numbers say 20 dB, and I have the threshold is set at 10 dB. Everything that goes above 10 dB is going to be cut down to 15 dB if it was 20 dB, I think. I don't know if that's how the numbers work, but that's kind of the idea. Is what's happening is everything above a certain threshold is getting attenuated by the ratio that you're going with. And then there's an attack knob, which is how fast it gets attenuated. which if you have a kick drum, for example, it's a very thing with you want to keep the transient. It has a lot of transient, which a transient is just a kind of fast sound. It comes in loud and it trails off quick, like a drum sound. And you want to keep the transient. So maybe you have an attack of, say, like 30 milliseconds. And so that's going to allow the transient to stick through. And everything after that amount of time is going to be compressed fully. And so that's more or less how compressors work, is they usually they cut down the peaks of your mix. And then often people use makeup gain to bring everything back to a larger volume. And so essentially what happens is your quieter elements are closer in volume to your loudest elements. And so as far as mixing goes, I want to talk about a couple things. And one of them is side chaining. So side chaining is a kind of compression, which is basically, it's not constantly running. If you put a normal compressor on an element, it's going to always be running based on the input that it's getting. But a sidechain compressor activates when it receives an input from something else. Most often, this is with the kick side chaining to other elements in a mix, often the bass. And so that means when the kick hits, it's going to activate the compressor, which is going to limit the volume of the bass. It's going to compress it, so that way the kick can punch through without creating a lot of potential distortion and weird sounds going on in your lows. And sidechain to the kick, like I said, it's the most common thing that probably people talk about when they say sidechaining, and it's really effective for kind of creating space in your mix for the element that kind of a lot of dance music or pop music is based on, that kick drum. And it also gives you more headroom, because if you have a sub element playing while the kick plays, it's going to add together or it's going to phase cancel, and you're going to get a lot of weirdness. So sidechaining to the kick is really, really nice. The other thing that's really commonly done is sidechaining things to your vocals if you're working on a vocal track. And so this is taking, say, your background elements, say it's like a lead guitar, but you're taking a vocal, and whenever the vocal is going, you're slightly compressing the volume of your other elements. And this allows the vocal to really pop through, which is really important. You want to make sure that the vocal is crystal clear in a lot of genres of music. And then the last thing, as far as sidechaining goes, and this is kind of a more fun thing, is you can sidechain the effects on a plugin to its source. So one thing I like to do is I will route a track to a reverb bus, and then I will sidechain that reverb against the original sound. So then you have this reverb, but as soon as the original sound plays, it's completely attenuated. So the sound can play, it's just the dry sound, but as soon as it stops playing, the reverb kind of sucks back in. It creates a really cool effect. So that's less of a mixing trick and more of just something to think about as fun with sidechaining. And so the other tip I just want to say is that while you want to compress a lot of elements of your mix in order to help them fit well with each other as far as volume goes, please don't over compress things. You don't want to compress your kick so hard that the transient goes away. You don't want to compress each element to their loudest volume, because your track still needs to be mastered after you mix it. And that's where all the volume is really going to come from. So though you probably should compress a lot of elements individually, don't go too hard with it, because then it will lose all of its dynamic power. And this is going to be kind of brief, but I'm going to talk about distortion. The first thing I want to say is this is kind of the same as the compression, is that it should be tasteful, it should add some fun, but don't go overboard with it. For a lot of genres, you don't want to hear that kind of distortion element. For a lot of them, you do, and that can be a lot of fun. But even then, you don't want to go overboard with it. You want to retain, you want to really be thinking about the character of the sound you want to be making, what kind of timbre you want. And so be careful with that. And so after that, something that can be fun to play with while mixing is saturation. If you have an element that's maybe a bit quieter in your mix and you want it to be a bit louder, something that can be fun to do, or you want it to be more present, I should say. Maybe it's already feeling loud enough. You can add a little bit of saturation. And so saturation is just a very simple kind of distortion, and it'll add volume, and it'll also add some extra kind of frequencies. And so it can add this kind of extra power and oomph to a sound that maybe was lacking some in your mix. So that can be a fun thing to play with if you have a sound that just isn't coming through how you want to, is add some subtle saturation. I think for those who use Ableton, they have saturators, which are called saturators when you look them up. But FL Studio, I think the native saturator is called Wave Shaper. And it's just a graph with like a line in it. And if you just bend that up a bit, you're adding saturation distortion. So I think that's FL's native saturator. And so the last thing there is clipping. And so clipping, for those of you who don't know what it is, this is what happens when you're playing something and things are going over 0 dB. The maximum loudness when it goes over there, if you don't have, well, most modern computers will allow you to play stuff at 0 dB without killing everything. But especially audio systems, especially slightly older audio systems, if you play something over 0 dB, it's going to add a lot of distortion. And this is mainly an issue when it comes into mastering. But something that can be cool with clipping is that especially lately, people have been playing around with purposely clipping elements of their mix using clipping plugins, which are often saturation plugins, for the characteristic distortion that they add. And so that can be a fun thing to add a certain buzzy timbre to a sound. The next thing is reverb. Is kind of continuing the trend of don't use too much of it. And this is kind of the big one, especially for early producers. I know I fell into this trend of, wow, reverb sounds so cool. I want to put it on everything and I want a lot of it. But what happens is when you do that, everything just becomes a washing mess. I still do this. To this day, one of the biggest things that happens when I go into mixing is I have to turn down all my reverb knobs and kind of bring everything back into something that makes a little bit more sense. So for almost everything you're going to do in a song, your reverb wet to dry knob or dry to wet knob should be at less than 50%. Probably for most elements, it'll be less than about 30. So be careful about adding too much reverb to your mix. Something that can be fun to practice, especially if you're working in a more traditional song, is limiting your reverb to only maybe 4 or 5 tracks in your mix. Maybe don't put it on your cymbals this time, put it on your guitars and your snare and your vocals, and then try and see what kind of space you can create without putting it on everything. And then along with that, and this goes for reverb, but also for other spatial effects like delays, is that you often want to cut your highs and lows for that a little bit. And this goes into what I was talking about with headroom, is that you're getting the feeling of the reverb without necessarily as much high or low frequency. So it's a good idea to cut them down so that they're not taking up so much space in your mix as you're getting ready to be mastered. Yeah.
Can you explain what wet and dry actually is?
Oh yeah. So essentially what wet and dry is you're mixing the amount of the effect. You're mixing the sound of the sound without any processing on it, like without any reverb, with the full effect. So 100% wet, you're only hearing just the reverb sound. If you're taking a reverb plugin, you put it on, you dial it up to 100%, you're just hearing the reverb. You're not hearing any of the dry or original sound. And so really sometimes it's contained in one wet dry knob, which goes from just the original sound to just the reverb. Sometimes you see it as 2 knobs, one wet, one dry, where you can change the volume of both of them individually. But generally speaking, you want your wet dry knob below 50% at least for most elements. that aren't like really just spatial effects. Okay, and so now we've kind of done what we like about our mix. We've used the tips and tricks from EQs and stuff. The next thing we want to do is make sure that you're checking your mix on multiple systems. You know, maybe you're just working on headphones and you like all the stereo effects that you've put in, but you haven't really heard them yet. So you want to test them on any speakers you can get your hands on. I'm telling you, use a car stereo, use your phone speakers to hear what something really tinny sounds like on your mix without all the bass. I mean, any stereo system you can get your hands on. If you have monitors, stereo monitors or speakers, those are wonderful. If you can maybe rent time at a studio to test stuff, that's awesome. You can really get a feel for how your mix will sound. Try it on different headphones if you can. Maybe try some earbuds. And then try your mix at different volumes. This is kind of related thing, is that your mix will probably sound really cool and awesome at a high volume every time. You're gonna love how it sounds when it's really loud. So turn it down. Try and see how you like the sound of your mix at a lower volume, because a lot of people are gonna listen to it there. So you gotta be prepared to account for that. And there's an element of that which is gonna come from mastering. Mastering is gonna help your music sound better at lower volumes. But try and make a mix that sounds good at a lower volume as well. And the last thing is try your mix in mono. There's a lot of stereo systems out there still which don't actually give people music in stereo. I guess it's not a stereo system, but a speaker setup where people are not listening to your mix in stereo. And so they're only going to hear the mix summed to mono. And like I said, this is going to cause a lot. Potentially, it's going to cause a lot of phase cancellation, which can be a problem for your mix. So you want to make sure you can hear it in mono and like how it sounds. One thing that's cool about this really awesome plugin I told you guys about the first time is this thing in the bottom is what they call the correlation meter, and it tells you how it gives you kind of an idea of how good your mix might sound in mono as far as phase cancellation goes. If your mix is hanging over here for the most part, you're doing good. If it's over here, you might have some problems that need working out, especially in your low end, as far as phase cancellation goes. So those are things that you definitely want to do as you're thinking about wrapping up your mix. And this is kind of something that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because it's a really complicated science topic, but I mentioned phase cancellation, and it's really apparent in things like sub-bass because it's really low frequency. Phase cancellation is very slow, so you can hear it happening a lot of the time. But there's a lot of really important phasing elements throughout the entire frequency spectrum of your mix. And so what I would recommend is, if you're loving how your mix sounds, mostly you feel comfortable using all these other tricks and tips that I've shown you, maybe do a little bit of research on how to deal with phase in mixing. One thing I know we love it, but OTT, that beautiful, lovely plugin which makes everything sound so nice and juicy, it adds a lot of weird phasing elements to your highs, which can, for a lot of maybe more traditional styles of music, can add a weird element to your mix. So I would recommend, if you would like to have if you have some free time and you feel really comfortable about everything else, do some research on how to deal with phase problems in your mix. I'm not qualified to really talk about that yet. And so the last thing I just want to say is take breaks, give your ears time to rest and get back to it. If you're listening to your mix and it's just not feeling right, put it down. Don't go changing a bunch of knobs and really changing how your mix sounds. Give it a few hours, maybe come back tomorrow and see what you think then, because you might just have some ear fatigue, you might just be tired. So take breaks, and then know that mixing is not objective. Add an element of creative mixing. Mastering is a much more objective process of bringing your track up to proper loudness. Mixing can really be, though we talk about some things you maybe should or shouldn't do with your mix, it really is how you like your song to sound. So keep that in mind and just have fun mixing. Yeah, that's what I have to say. If there's any questions, you guys feel free to ask them. Yeah.
So I know in FL, it's like three main like definitions. There's like the one the game now, I guess.
Uh-huh.
And there's like the wave shifter, like and there's also the soft flipper.
Soft flipper, yeah. Soft flipper is a saturation.
You know what the difference is?
No, not exactly. I know that Maximus, the kind of main big compression thing that FL has a saturation element. And I really think that if you're just going for some subtle saturation, as far as mixing goes, any of those three will work, as long as you kind of understand how to use each one, like which knob does the saturation in Maximus. Other than that, I think it's the kind of differences between them don't matter for this. Maybe if you were trying to use them as a sound design saturator, it might be more important, but I don't know the differences that much myself.
I just know like soft flipping is doing is that everything in your sound is over 0 decibels. It'll just make it, so you can imagine like a wave going over line at 0, and it'll just like flatten it off.
Yeah.
So you have to sign those through the square.
Right, it's just clipping distortion. But yeah, it uses saturation to do that. But yeah, I think if you're trying to get a little bit of subtle saturation, I think any of those will work. Yeah.
If you're side tuning the bass kick, is there like a rule for the what do you call it, the decay or whatever, like making it so that you get the full function of the kick without like having a weird like, you understand what I'm asking?
Sure. There's not like a rule. I mean, you could probably, open up you could probably put your kick into like, I don't know, Audacity and see like how many milliseconds you have before it tails off. And then use that as your decay factor. But a lot of it just comes down to kind of listening and hearing what sounds nice to you, especially for what kind of genre you're working in. There's certain, especially in dance genres, where you want a really hard compression that really shuts everything down when the kick plays, and then everything bleeds back in, and a lot of elements where it's a lot more subtle. As much as it's kind of annoying to hear this, it's really kind of a taste thing, and you experimenting, hearing what sounds good. And a lot of that can come with testing on multiple systems. You can kind of hear whether you like how the bass fits in with the kick. So yeah, that's what I would say. Anyone else?
Seems like the general rule for
The long attack on
You mean for compressing a kick?
yeah.
Oh yeah, if you're compressing a kick, you want to have a long attack so that the transient comes through. But for sidechain compression, you want a quick attack to compress the bass. Yeah. Yeah, what's up? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so that's actually kind of a good point. Is when you're doing this, when you're attenuating harmful or resonant frequencies, you're not necessarily trying to get rid of them. What you're doing is you're just pulling down kind of the volume in that frequency space, so that they aren't punching through as much, so you don't hear them as much. So you're just kind of dragging down the volume. You really don't want to take away more than maybe 4 to 6 dB off of any given frequency area. So when you do that, if you make it a tight enough filter, so I don't know how like Ableton's native filters works, but in a lot of filters you have like little like kind of points that you drag around, and if you like scroll on them, you can make them tighter or wider. So if you just make it really tight, and then just kind of cut maybe 3 to 6 dB out of a specific range. You're not going to destroy the timbre of your sound, but you are going to kind of reduce the effect that those resonant frequencies have. It can be both. I would say generally it's usually an individual sound, but especially when it comes to the mastering stage, you have an EQ over the whole song, and maybe then you're doing some very minimal or kind of very careful cuts in certain frequencies. Yeah.
Do you like FL's native compressor? Or do you recommend?
Maximus or?
Yeah.
I like Maximus. I do. There are a lot of really good compressors out there. I mean, OTT is a very fun compressor to use, very simple. And I think if you're using it kind of carefully, you're not going to run into a lot of problems. Like if you're not using it on every element and everything, like on the kick and the snare and the bass and the lead, you're not going to run into a ton of huge problematic things. And it really is more of a subtle difference or a subtle problem, which mostly people who are really I'm losing the word, but kind of really careful about how their production is rather than their song and trying to get a song out there, then they are the ones who are really going to care. But most compressors are generally decent, but FL's native Maximus, now that it's like included in FL, I think it wasn't when I first got it. You had to like buy Maximus, like, but now that it's included, I think it's a really good compressor if you're using FL Studio. I think Ableton uses the glue compressor, like that's a really good one. Yeah. So. So I guess that's a good point too, is after you finish your mix, if you're going to be sending this to anybody to master it, you want to take any master effects off. You want to export the track as just the mixed thing without any extra compression to help you maybe hear it at a different volume or with compression. You're going to want to take it all off. Yeah. Because I mean, you say you mix with a limiter on, but is it just sitting there or is it doing, are you actively limiting?
It's like, you know, like ozone, like or even out and like louder.
Yeah. So that you would want to turn off before you put out your mix to somebody to master, or potentially before you master it. You want to export everything into one audio file, then open a new project file, and then start your mastering from there. Anyone else? Cool. Well, I guess we're probably gonna adjourn here.
Good. Yeah, there's a new beat pack out. You know, same new as usual. We'll present on next week. If you guys have midterms, no worries. Obviously, that's usual. And yeah, thanks again, Zach. It was an awesome presentation.
Cool. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Yeah. With that, feel free to hang out any longer you want to, or head on out, get to studying.
Yeah.